Burnt Toast!
A particularly energetic first set there tonight on the Burnt Toast Show. I hope you enjoyed it. That last track was Joni Mitchell with her song Woodstock, which was kind of a legendary song. She sort of made the actual event a little more legendary by writing that song. The story is that she came to New York with Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and they, because she was Graham Nash's girlfriend at the time, and they made her stay in the hotel room because they weren't sure it was going to be safe. So she watched it on TV and wrote this song. The first person to record the song, actually, the first artists to record the song, were Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. And after that, there was a group called Matthews Southern Comfort that also had a hit with it. She recorded it herself at least 3 times on albums. And this was a particularly, as I said, energetic version from an album called Miles of Isles from 1974. It was on the tour, recorded live on the tour for her Court and Spark album that was released earlier that year. She was using the band, the LA Express, Tom Scott and the LA Express. She would come out and do, well, they would open, and then she would come out and do some acoustic numbers, and then they would join her. And they would have a break, and the last song before the break, they wanted it to be kind of up and energetic. And that was this one, Woodstock, a very, very distinctive arrangement of this one. Joni Mitchell on the vocals, Tom Scott on the saxophone, Robin Ford on the guitar, Larry Nash on the keyboards, and the great rhythm section of Max Bennett on the bass and John Guerin on the drums. Joni Mitchell, Woodstock. Before that, we heard, back when I was on the radio, which wasn't that long ago, I was on the radio for 28 years. And in those 28 years, the most played song on the Burnt Toast Show was Buddy Miles' Down by the River, from Buddy Miles Live from 1971. He was kind of at a high point in his career at that time. He Hendrix had passed in 70, but he had played with Hendrix on the Band of Gypsies album. There was a lot of momentum. He had done an album called Them Changes that was a pretty big hit. And this was the next album after that, this live album from 71. The cover was by an artist that we've talked about already, Monty Clairwine. There he is again. But this was his version of Neil Young's Down by the River, which I believe is on Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere, which I think was Neil's second album. Buddy Miles there on the drums and vocals, David Hall on the bass and vocals, Charlie Karp on the guitar and vocals, and then we get into the soloists. Donnie Beck on the organ, a solo so impressive that Buddy yells encouragement at him in the middle of the solo. Stemsy Hunter on the alto saxophone, Hank Red, who later played with Stevie Wonder, on the tenor saxophone, Tom Hall on the trumpet, and Bob Hoggins on the trombone. Everybody gets to solo, that's what makes it so great. Before that, another extended live track, the Tedeschi Trucks Band, from their EP called High and Mighty from 2018. That was recorded live in Chicago in 2018, at least this track was. Shame. And that was Derek Trucks on the slide and lead guitar, Susan Tedeschi on the lead vocals and rhythm guitar, J.J. Johnson and Tyler Greenwell on the drums, Tim LaFave on the bass, Kofi Burbridge on the keyboards, Mike Madison, Mark Rivers, and Alicia Shakur on the background vocals, and the horn section of Kebby Williams on tenor saxophone, Ephraim Owens on the trumpet, and Elizabeth Leah on the trombone. The Tedeschi Trucks Band, Shame. I like the fact that 2 songs took up 25 minutes. I think that's cool. That's very Burnt Toast Show. Before that, we heard Joe Cocker from his second album with his first really big hit, Feelin' All Right, a radical reinterpretation of a song written by Dave Mason for the first Traffic album. I think it's the first one, but Traffic had originally done that, and the Traffic version is very different. Traffic was a really creative band, but they kind of applied this, Joe Cocker and this pianist, Artie Butler, who was a session musician, kind of applied this kind of Ray Charles kind of Latin thing to it, and that's kind of made it the definitive version. The album is called With a Little Help from My Friends from 1969, and that was David Bennett Cohen on the guitar, Artie Butler on the piano, Carol Kay on the bass, Paul Humphrey on the drums, Laudir de Oliveira on congas and percussion, and Mary Clayton on the background vocals. Now let's talk about some of these folks. Carol Kay, the bass player, played on so many great records out of California in the 1960s. She played on all the Beach Boys records. She played on Sonny and Cher's records. The Beat Goes On, that's her. Good Vibrations, that's her. Very identifiable bass sounds. She played on Wichita Lineman, Glenn Campbell. She played on all sorts of records, and she's on this. I didn't know that Joe Cocker actually recorded in America at that time, but I guess he did. Paul Humphrey on the drums. Paul Humphrey, the big triumvirate for Paul Humphrey that I always like to talk about is that he was on Black Cow by Steely Dan. He was on Let's Get It On by Marvin Gaye. And then every Sunday night, he was on the Lawrence Welk Show playing drums in his matching suit because all their suits matched. It was pretty easy to tell which one Paul Humphrey was, if you know where I'm coming from. But that was Paul Humphrey. Laudir de Oliveira, the Brazilian percussionist on congas and percussion. Laudir de Oliveira at that time, I believe, was a percussionist with Sergio Mendes in Brazil, probably 77 at that time. It was originally Brazil 66, but I think by that time he changed it to Brazil 77. And later, he joined the band Chicago a couple years later, probably 4 years later. I think his first album with them, where he was a full-time member, was Chicago 7. Mary Clayton on the background vocals. Mary Clayton, the sister of Sam Clayton from Little Feat, and a very famous background vocalist, most famous for her vocal performance on Gimme Shelter by the Rolling Stones. Joe Cocker had a great band on that song. Joe Cocker, of course, one of the great soul vocalists of all time from Sheffield, England. Before Joe Cocker, we heard the Wood Brothers from a 2023 album called Heart is the Hero. We heard a track called Pilgrim. Slow down, your soul can't travel that fast. Oliver Wood on the guitar and the vocals. Chris Wood, who we know from Medeski, Martin and Wood from many years ago, on acoustic bass and background vocals. And Jano Ricks playing drums, keyboards, and background vocals. Jano Ricks plays drums and keyboards. If you see them live, he plays drums and keyboards at the same time. So, like, drums aren't hard enough by themselves. So he also sings. So he's got a keyboard over here. He's playing drums with his left hand, and he's singing background vocals. That's a multitasker there, Jano Ricks. Wood Brothers, Pilgrim. Before that, we heard Marcus King from his album called Young Blood from 2022. We heard a track called It's Too Late, not to be confused with the It's Too Late by Carole King. This is a totally different song. A great shuffle there from Marcus King. That was produced by Dan Auerbach of the Black Keys. He did a couple albums with Marcus King. That was Marcus King on the guitar and the vocals, Nick Movshin on the bass, and Chris St. Hilaire on the drums. Let's talk about those two gentlemen. Nick Movshin was very involved with Daptone Records and played with both Sharon Jones and the Dap Kings and Charles Bradley and the Menahan Street Band. He was in both of those bands. And Chris St. Hilaire was one of the two members of the London Souls, a really great duo that was around for a while, Chris Hilaire. Marcus King with It's Too Late from Youngblood. Before that, we heard Little Feat, the title track from their album Chinese Work Songs from 2000, and that was their 13th LP. That song was written by the keyboardist Bill Payne and the guitarist Fred Tackett. Paul Barrere on the lead vocals and guitar, Bill Payne on the keyboards and background vocals, Fred Tackett on the guitar, Kenny Gradney on the bass, Richie Hayward on the drums, Sam Clayton on percussion and background vocals, and Sean Murphy on the background vocals. Little Feat, Chinese Work Songs. Work, work, work. Before that, we started off tonight with an extremely energetic song, and probably the best known song from Chris Robinson Brotherhood, from their first album, Big Moon Ritual, that came out in 2012. That was the band was formed when the Black Crowes broke up. One of the times that the Black Crowes broke up in 2011. Full Moon Ritual, as I said, was their debut. It was intended to, I'm rating this now, intended to evoke mystical and psychedelic experiences. Let's do that again. Intended to evoke mystical and psychedelic experiences. Okay. They were influenced by the Grateful Dead, which was a band that Chris Robinson got into while he was with the Black Crowes, and it kind of split the Black Crowes apart because the other Black Crowes were not real big deadheads. They did all this stuff because Chris wanted to, and he was kind of integral to the Black Crowes. But this band, as I said, started in 2011. This was released in 2012. We heard the song Rosalie. Chris Robinson on the vocals and the guitar, Neil Casal on lead guitar and background vocals, Adam McDougall on keyboards and background vocals, Mark Muddy Dutton on the bass, George Sluppick, Memphis' own George Sluppick on the drums, and as I said, that was probably their most popular song. It's interesting now if you look at what Chris Robinson was doing back then with who he is now. He seems to have changed into a completely different person and has completely different ambitions. I know they're touring, Black Crowes are touring in this coming year, opening for Guns N' Roses. And you just don't think about Chris Robinson Brotherhood really being that type of band, or Chris Robinson being that type of player after a while. One more time, I want to remind you that our sponsor for tonight is Premier Chiropractic, Dr. John McDonald, 7113 West Jefferson Boulevard in Fort Wayne. It's an affordable walk-in clinic, and Dr. John does great work. I can tell you personally, Dr. John does wonderful work, and I really appreciate his sponsorship. If you're interested in sponsoring the show, well, there's a link in the description. If you're interested in supporting the show, there's a link in the description. It's like there's a link in the description. Anyway, we're going to talk about what's next. We're going to do a 3-song set, and then we're going to run down an album spotlight for tonight. So the 3 songs are pretty expansive songs for the most part. There's a lot going on there. And I don't want to give you too much information all at once, but that's kind of what I do, isn't it? We'll start off with Traffic from their 5th studio LP from November of 1971. It was, interestingly enough, a huge hit in America, but in their native United Kingdom, it was a complete flop. But here, I think it's still their best-known album, The Low Spark of High-Heeled Boys. We'll hear the title track, Steve Winwood on the lead vocals, piano, and organ, Chris Wood on the saxophone, Jim Capaldi on percussion, Rick Gretsch on the bass, Jim Gordon on the drums, and one of my favorite names ever, Rebop Kwakuba on the percussion. Rick Gretsch on the bass had come with Steve Winwood from Blind Faith. Traffic had broken up for a while. Steve Winwood formed Blind Faith for one album with Eric Clapton, Ginger Baker, and Rick Gretsch, and he brought Rick Gretsch with him until he had to fire him because they just partied a little too hard. Jim Gordon on the drums had played on every record that came out of California in the 1960s, and he played with Derek and the Dominoes before this. He played drums and piano on Layla, the Layla album and the Layla song. And then Rebop Kwakuba later played with Jimmy Cliff. Later played with Jimmy Cliff and was one of those people who died on stage. He died on stage of a heart attack in the 1980s, I believe. But this is probably their most well-known song, or one of their most well-known songs here in America. That's Low Spark of High-Heeled Boys. After that, we'll hear another Traffic song, just not by Traffic. Actually, there's 3 Traffic songs tonight. But this one was by Blood, Sweat, and Tears from their 3rd album, called, appropriately enough, Blood, Sweat, and Tears 3. It was the follow-up to the hugely successful self-titled album that came out in 1969, won a Grammy, made him a headliner at Woodstock. The interesting thing about this song is that it's a Traffic song, a very unusual Traffic song, but it also features themes from Bela Bartok, the classical composer, Sergei Prokofiev, the classical composer, and Thelonious Monk, the great jazz composer, sometimes all at once. Interesting Celeste part at the beginning and the end as well. David Clayton Thomas on the vocals, Jim Fielder on the bass, Bobby Colomby on the drums, Steve Katz on the guitar, Dick Halligan on keyboards, trombone, and flute, Fred Lipsius on alto saxophone and piano, Jerry Hyman on trombone, Chuck Winfield, and Lou Soloff on the trumpets. So it's Traffic, Bartok, Prokofiev, and Monk all at once. That music should still be like that, in my humble opinion. After that, we'll close out tonight's music part of the show before we get to the album spotlight with Gary Clark Jr. from his album from 2024 called JPEG Raw, with a track called Habits. Nice, long, expansive track that I like very much. Gary Clark Jr. on the lead and background vocals and the guitars, John Diaz on the organ and the electric piano, Elijah Ford on the bass, J.J. Johnson, who we heard earlier with the Tedeschi Trucks Band on the drums and percussion, and then Savannah Ali, Shannon Ashley, and Sean Alicia on the background vocals, Gary Clark. So the next three songs, Traffic, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, and Gary Clark Jr. coming up for you. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you're digging it so far. Stay tuned for the album Spotlight. Next week, we're going to have something really special, but I'm not going to tell you what that is. It's episode 3 here today, tonight, this afternoon, whenever you're watching. That's the beauty of doing this on YouTube instead of on the radio. You can watch it anytime. I would like to make sure that you know that each and every week we are sponsored by Dr. John McDonald, my dear friend Dr. John McDonald, at Premier Chiropractic, 7113 West Jefferson Boulevard, Fort Wayne, Indiana. I'm Todd Harold. You're checking out The Burnt Toast Show.